I used to believe that after 42 years of marriage, there could be no doors left between two people. I was wrong. The first time I saw the little white cottage at the edge of Briar Hollow, I thought it was charming. It sat beyond a grove of tall pines, quiet and almost shy, like it didn't want to be noticed. My husband, Leonard, slowed the car when we passed it one autumn afternoon, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "That one's not ours to worry about," he said gently when I asked about it. It seemed like such an odd thing to say. You see, Leonard and I had built everything together. We had started with nothing but a tiny apartment and a second-hand couch. We worked long hours, raised our son, buried our parents, and celebrated every anniversary with the same lemon pie he loved. We shared passwords, bank accounts, dreams. So when I found out, years later, that he owned that cottage and that I was never to step foot inside it, something inside me shifted. He didn't yell. Leonard was never cruel, but the one time I asked directly, "Why can't I go there with you?" his voice turned firm in a way I had never heard before. "That house is separate from us, Margaret. Please respect that. Separate from us." Those words followed me for years. He would go there twice a month, always alone. Sometimes he came back quiet, sometimes thoughtful. Once, I noticed his eyes were red, as if he had been crying. But when I reached for his hand, he simply smiled and asked about dinner. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe it was a business investment. Maybe it was a workshop. Maybe it was something he needed for himself. Marriage, after all, allows for small private spaces, but secrets grow roots when left in the dark. Then Leonard fell ill. It happened quickly. What we thought was fatigue turned into hospital visits, then long nights filled with machines humming beside our bed. He never spoke about the cottage during those months. Not once. And I was too afraid to ask. The day he passed, it felt like someone had quietly removed the air from the world. I remember holding his hand long after it had grown cold, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. 3 days after the funeral, our lawyer called. "There's something you need to collect," he said carefully. "A key and a letter." My hands trembled when I opened the envelope. Inside was a single brass key and a note written in Leonard's familiar handwriting. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then it's time. The cottage is yours now. Please go there alone, and when you do, look carefully. I left you the truth." I stared at those words for a very long time. The truth. I thought I already knew my husband. I thought there was nothing left to uncover. But the following morning, I drove to Briar Hollow with that key resting heavily in my purse. And when I stood in front of the cottage door, hand shaking as I slid the key into the lock, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I was afraid of what love might have been hiding from me all along. And when the door finally creaked open, I froze. The smell hit me first. Not dust, not decay, but lavender. It was faint, soft, like the sachets I used to tuck into our dresser drawers when we were newly married. For a moment, standing in that doorway, I felt as if I had stepped backward through time instead of forward into a secret. The cottage wasn't empty, it was lived in. A small sofa sat near the fireplace, neatly covered with a cream-colored throw. A wooden desk stood by the window. The curtains were clean. Sunlight streamed in as though the house had been waiting for it. For me, my heart pounded so loudly I had to close the door behind me just to steady myself. I don't know what I had expected. Evidence of betrayal, perhaps. Another life. Another woman's perfume lingering in the air. Instead, I saw something far more unsettling. The walls were covered in photographs, not of strangers, of me, dozens of them. Some I remembered, some I didn't. There was one from our 30th anniversary dinner. Leonard had insisted on taking a picture of me outside the restaurant because he said the light made my hair glow. Another from the morning I retired from teaching, holding flowers from my students. A photo of me asleep in the hospital chair during his treatment, my head resting awkwardly against the wall. I stepped closer. Every picture was labeled in his careful handwriting. Margaret laughing after burning the pie. Margaret on the porch, pretending not to cry after our son left for college. Margaret dancing in the kitchen when she thinks no one is watching. My knees nearly gave out. This wasn't a second life. This was an archive. On the desk sat several leather-bound notebooks stacked in perfect order. My name was written across the spines. My name. I sat slowly in the wooden chair and opened the first one. The date at the top of the page was from 21 years ago. Today Margaret didn't know I followed her to the garden just to watch her kneel in the dirt and talk to her roses. She thinks I don't notice how she hums when she's happy. I notice everything. Tears blurred the ink. Page after page, year after year, he had written about me. Not grand things, not dramatic events, but the small, quiet moments that make up a life. The way I chewed my lip when I worried. The way I saved the ends of candles because they might still be useful. The way I always left the porch light on if our son was out late. It was overwhelming. But beneath the warmth of those words, something else stirred confusion. Why hide this from me? Why forbid me from entering? As I turned to the final pages of the most recent notebook, my breath caught. The tone had changed. The handwriting was shakier. If you're reading this, Margaret, then I didn't have the courage to tell you face to face. I couldn't bear to see that look in your eyes. My hands trembled. There are things about the cottage you must understand. I kept this place for a reason, not just to remember you, but to protect you. Protect me. From what? I stood slowly, scanning the room again, this time not as a wife discovering love, but as a woman sensing something unfinished. And then I noticed it. Behind the bookshelf near the far wall, the floorboards were uneven, slightly raised, as if something had been moved or hidden, and suddenly the cottage didn't feel like a shrine anymore. It felt like a confession waiting to be uncovered. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when you realize you've only seen half the story. I knelt slowly beside the bookshelf, my fingers brushing the edge of the uneven floorboard. For a moment, I simply stared at it, as if it might explain itself. My heart wasn't racing the way it had before. It was heavier now, steadier, like it already sensed that whatever lay beneath would change something I thought I understood. Leonard had never been dramatic. He wasn't the kind of man to build secret compartments or hide treasure. He believed in tidy ledgers, clear plans, and paying bills on time. So why this? I pressed down gently on the board. It shifted. My breath caught in my throat. With more effort than I expected, I lifted it. Beneath it was not jewelry, not cash, not letters from another woman. It was a small metal lockbox, plain, gray, unremarkable, but my hands trembled as I pulled it out and set it on the wooden floor beside me. For a long moment, I just looked at it. There was a key taped to the underside of the lid I had lifted. Leonard had thought of everything. I peeled it off carefully, my fingertips cold despite the warm afternoon sun spilling through the window. When the lock clicked open, I hesitated. I remember whispering out loud, "What were you protecting me from, Leonard?" Inside were documents, stacks of them, property records, bank statements, legal forms, and beneath those, medical files. My chest tightened. The first page I unfolded bore his name, dated nearly 8 years ago. 8 years. I scanned the lines, the clinical language swimming before my eyes. A diagnosis. Progressive. Degenerative. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. Leonard had known he was sick long before he ever told me he felt tired, long before the hospital visits, long before I noticed his hands trembling when he poured his coffee. He had known, and he hadn't told me. The realization wasn't anger at first. It was disbelief. I felt as though the room tilted slightly, as if the cottage itself had shifted on its foundation. Why carry that alone? Why let me believe the illness had come suddenly, like a cruel accident of fate, when it had been slowly approaching all along? I flipped through more papers. There were notes from specialists, treatment options he had declined, financial plans carefully constructed to ensure I would never struggle. Every decision was calculated, every risk accounted for. And then I found the letter tucked beneath the stack. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to someone named Daniel Harper. I had never heard that name in my life. The letter was brief. "Daniel, the arrangement remains the same. If my condition progresses faster than expected, you are to proceed as discussed. Margaret must not be burdened with the details. She deserves peace." My fingers went numb. Arrangement. Proceed as discussed. The lavender-scented air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This wasn't just a memory house. This wasn't just love preserved in ink and photographs. There was something Leonard had set in motion, something involving a stranger, something he believed would protect me. And for the first time since opening that cottage door, a quiet fear began to bloom in my chest. Not fear of betrayal, but fear that my husband had been fighting a battle I never even knew existed, and that perhaps it wasn't over yet. I have always believed that marriage means facing storms together. So, realizing that my husband had weathered one alone felt like discovering a crack in the very foundation of my life. I sat there on the cottage floor far longer than I intended, the letter to this mysterious Daniel Harper resting in my lap. The late afternoon light had shifted from golden to gray before I finally stood, my knees stiff, my thoughts even stiffer. Who was Daniel? A doctor? A lawyer? A friend I had never been told about? Leonard had never been secretive about the people in his life. He didn't keep hidden friendships. He didn't disappear for days without explanation. He was steady, predictable, safe. Yet here I was, holding proof that for nearly 8 years he had been living with knowledge he had chosen not to share with me. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back inside the lockbox. My hands moved slowly, as if any sudden motion might cause the fragile truth to shatter. Then I noticed something I had missed before. Tucked inside the lid of the box was a small folded card. It wasn't sealed. It was simply resting there, as if Leonard had expected me to find it only after seeing everything else. I opened it. Margaret, if you've reached this part, then I trust you've seen enough to know why I made certain choices. Please do not be frightened. I was not hiding from you. I was building something for you, building something. My heart tightened. You have always carried others on your shoulders, our son, your students, your parents, even me. You do not know how to rest. And I knew that when the time came, you would try to give away everything we built, out of guilt or grief or habit. I couldn't allow that. I blinked back tears. It was true. I had already been thinking of downsizing, donating, simplifying. The house felt too large without him, the savings too heavy without a shared future. There are people who will approach you soon, the note continued. They will speak of partnerships, investments, help. They will make it sound generous. It is not. Daniel has been helping me ensure that you will not be cornered or manipulated. He knows what to do. Trust him once, then decide for yourself. My pulse began to throb in my ears. Cornered, manipulated. By whom? Leonard had always managed our finances, yes, but I wasn't helpless. I had a career. I had common sense. I wasn't naive. And yet, in the weeks since his death, there had been phone calls, subtle ones. A distant cousin asking about future plans. A former colleague of Leonard's offering to assist with restructuring assets. Even my own brother had gently suggested that handling property alone might be overwhelming. at my age. At the time, I had brushed them off. Now I wondered if Leonard had anticipated every one of those conversations. The thought unsettled me more than the diagnosis had. Had he seen something I hadn't? Had he sensed a shift in people the moment they began to calculate what life would look like without him standing between them and me? I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse. Outside, the wind had begun to stir the trees. The cottage creaked softly, like an old ship adjusting to tide. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had discovered a betrayal. I felt like I had uncovered a plan. But plans, I have learned, can protect you or trap you. And as I locked the cottage door behind me that evening, one question echoed louder than the rest. What exactly had my husband set into motion? And was I strong enough to see it through? Grief makes you softer in places you didn't know could bruise. In the weeks after I opened the cottage, I began noticing things I might once have dismissed. The phone calls became more frequent, invitations to discuss options, subtle remarks about how complicated property management could be for someone my age. I smiled politely. I thanked them kindly, but inside, something had shifted. Leonard's words echoed in my mind. There are people who will approach you soon. And they were. The most persistent was a man named Victor Langley, a former business associate of Leonard's. He showed up at my front door one bright Tuesday morning, carrying a bakery box and a sympathetic expression. "Margaret," he said warmly, stepping inside before I had quite invited him. "Leonard would have wanted me to help you navigate things, especially the outlying property." The outlying property. He meant the cottage. My hands tightened around my teacup, though I kept my voice calm. "I wasn't aware you were involved in that." Victor's smile faltered for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. "Oh, not directly. But Leonard and I discussed potential development. The land's value has increased. It would be wise to act before taxes rise. Act, develop, sell." He spoke as if the cottage were a vacant lot instead of a place lined with my husband's careful handwriting. I thought of the lockbox, of the medical records, of the letter to Daniel Harper. "Thank you," I replied gently, "but I'm not making any decisions right now." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, with respect, waiting can be costly. I'd hate to see you taken advantage of." There it was, the suggestion that I was fragile, that I needed steering. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I drove to the cottage. This time, the door didn't feel frightening. It felt steady, familiar. I walked directly to the desk and opened the top drawer I hadn't explored before. Inside was a single envelope addressed to me in Leonard's handwriting, marked, "When someone insists." My heart skipped. I opened it carefully. "Margaret, if anyone pressures you regarding the property, it confirms what I feared. Some saw the cottage as opportunity long before I grew ill. Daniel has documentation that prevents any forced sale or partnership without your written consent under strict terms. He will explain. You must not sign anything until you speak to him. Beneath the note was a business card. Daniel Harper, estate consultant. A phone number. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me felt wounded. Why hadn't Leonard trusted me to handle this alone? Why build layers of protection instead of simply teaching me everything? But another part, the part that had seen Victor's smile slip, understood. Leonard hadn't doubted my intelligence. He had anticipated my vulnerability. There is a difference. Grief makes you want to please people. It makes you long for simplicity. It makes you tired. And tired people sign papers just to make conversations end. I sat at that desk and picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over the number. For 42 years, Leonard had handled storms quietly, shielding me from winds I didn't feel. Now, I stood at the edge of one I could sense approaching. If I dialed that number, I would be stepping into whatever plan he had constructed behind my back. If I didn't, I would be walking alone into territory others clearly believed I didn't understand. My hand trembled as I pressed the first digit, and when the line began to ring, I realized something that both frightened and steadied me at once. This wasn't just about protecting an old cottage. It was about discovering whether the woman Leonard believed I could become was already waiting inside me. The man who answered the phone did not sound like a mastermind. He sounded tired. Daniel Harper speaking. His voice was low, careful, not rushed, not overly warm, just steady. And for some reason, that steadiness made it easier for me to breathe. "This is Margaret Whitmore," I said softly. "My husband, Leonard Whitmore." There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, but recognition. "I've been expecting your call," he replied gently. I don't know why those words unsettled me. Perhaps because they meant Leonard had planned even this moment. That somewhere, months or maybe years ago, he had imagined me sitting alone with a phone in my hand. "I found the cottage," I continued, "and the documents, and your name." Daniel did not rush to explain. Instead, he asked, "Are you somewhere comfortable, Mrs. Whitmore?" The question caught me off guard. It was the kind of thing Leonard would ask. "I'm at the cottage," I answered. Another small pause. "Good. That's where he hoped you'd be." I sank slowly into the wooden chair at the desk. Daniel explained that he had worked quietly with Leonard for several years, not only restructuring assets, but creating legal barriers around the property. The cottage, it turned out, had once been part of a larger parcel Leonard co-owned with Victor Langley decades ago. When Leonard bought Victor out of the agreement, it hadn't been amicable. There were expectations, Daniel said carefully. Some people assumed your husband would eventually sell once he retired. When his health changed, certain individuals believed you might be persuaded to revisit old proposals. Persuaded. Such a polite word for pressure. Leonard anticipated that, Daniel continued. He placed the property into a protective trust. No development, no sale, no partnership can occur unless you explicitly request it. And even then, it requires a waiting period and independent review. I closed my eyes. He hadn't hidden the cottage to keep me out. He had hidden it to keep others out. And the medical records, I whispered. Daniel's voice softened. He didn't want you to watch him decline slowly. He told me you would carry the weight twice as hard if you knew too early. I advised transparency. He disagreed. A small, bittersweet smile touched my lips. Leonard had always believed he could outthink sorrow. He also asked me to remind you, Daniel added quietly, that the cottage was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a beginning. A beginning. I looked around the room again. The photographs, the journals, the careful preservation of ordinary love. What kind of beginning? I asked. That, Daniel replied, is entirely up to you. After we hung up, I remained seated for a long time. For weeks, I had felt as though Leonard had left me standing in a maze of secrets. But now, I began to see something different. He hadn't built a maze. He had built a shelter, not from enemies in dark coats and whispered conspiracies, but from subtle greed, from pity disguised as help, from the quiet assumption that an older widow must be overwhelmed. The realization did not erase the sting of being kept in the dark about his illness, but it did change the shape of my grief. I stood and walked to the wall of photographs again. Leonard had watched me live for decades. He had written about my strength in moments I didn't remember feeling strong at all. Perhaps this cottage was not proof of what he hid. Perhaps it was proof of what he believed. And as I traced my fingers along the frame of a photo labeled Margaret, choosing courage over comfort, I realized something else. Victor would not be the last to test my resolve, but for the first time since Leonard's passing, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't sorrow. It was readiness. I didn't expect the real test to come from my own family. Grief makes you look outward for threats, but sometimes the quietest pressures come from the people who claim to worry about you. It was my younger sister, Elaine, who brought it up first. We were sitting at my kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood where Leonard used to read the morning paper. She stirred her tea and cleared her throat the way she always did before saying something she had rehearsed. Margaret, she began gently, I've been thinking that Cottage is quite isolated, and managing two properties at your age, it might become exhausting. There it was again. At your age. I smiled politely. I manage just fine. She hesitated. Victor mentioned there are strong offers, substantial ones. It could set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. I looked at her carefully. Elaine, I'm already comfortable. Her cheeks flushed slightly. I just don't want you overwhelmed. You've always handled everything for everyone else. That part was true. But I could hear Leonard's voice in the back of my mind. You do not know how to rest. The irony was almost laughable. Everyone thought selling would make my life easier, but what none of them understood was that the cottage was not weight, it was anchor. A few days later, Victor returned, this time less friendly. "I hear you've spoken to Harper," he said, not bothering with pastries or pleasantries. "Yes," I replied calmly. He sighed. "Margaret, you're being advised conservatively. The land could be developed into something meaningful, housing, community space. Leonard and I once envisioned growth there." "Leonard bought you out," I said quietly. Victor's jaw tightened. "He made a mistake, and now you're letting sentiment cloud practicality." Sentiment. That word landed harder than he intended. You see, men like Victor believe love is a weakness in business. They believe emotion is naivete. What they don't understand is that emotion is often the clearest compass a person has. "I appreciate your concern," I said, standing from the chair. "But the cottage will remain as it is." "For how long?" he pressed. "For as long as it serves its purpose." "And what purpose is that?" I met his gaze fully then. "Mine." He left without shaking my hand. When the door closed behind him, I didn't tremble. I didn't second guess. Instead, I drove to the cottage. I walked inside and sat beneath the wall of photographs. The lavender scent still lingered faintly, like a quiet reminder that this space had been built with care. For the first time, I noticed something I had overlooked. On the desk was a blank journal identical to the others, but unused. Inside the cover, Leonard had written just one line: "For Margaret's next chapter." I ran my fingers across the empty pages. All this time, I thought the cottage was about what Leonard left behind. But perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was about what he believed I still had ahead of me. And as the late afternoon sun warmed the room, I realized something that made my chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with possibility. If I chose not to sell, then I would have to decide what to build instead. There is something both terrifying and beautiful about blank pages. I sat at Leonard's desk for nearly an hour, staring at that empty journal. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines, and the cottage creaked in its quiet rhythm. For the first time since his passing, the silence didn't feel hollow. It felt expectant. For weeks, everyone had spoken about what I should let go of. Sell the cottage, simplify, downsize, make life easier. But no one had asked what I might want to begin. I picked up the pen. My handwriting looked smaller than it used to, more careful, as if even my letters understood that something new was unfolding. Today I chose not to sell. The words felt steady. I wrote about Victor's visit, about Elaine's worry, about Daniel's calm voice explaining the trust Leonard had built. And then I wrote something I hadn't said aloud yet. I am not fragile. The truth is, I had begun to believe I was. Losing Leonard had felt like losing my balance. I had mistaken grief for weakness. But grief is not weakness. It is proof that something mattered. Over the next few days, I returned to the cottage not as a widow guarding a secret, but as a woman imagining possibility. I walked through each room carefully: the small kitchen, the cozy bedroom, the fireplace where Leonard must have sat alone, writing about the way I hummed in the garden. He had preserved my life here, but he hadn't filled the future. That part was left to me. One afternoon, as I stood near the window overlooking the clearing, I noticed something beyond the trees: a narrow dirt path I hadn't paid attention to before. It led toward the edge of town, toward a cluster of modest homes. I had driven past them countless times without much thought. But that day, I remembered something. During Leonard's illness, I had volunteered at the community center once a week, reading to older women who had no family nearby, women who spoke often of loneliness, women who said they wished there were places where they could simply gather without feeling like a burden. I looked around the cottage again. It was small, warm, intimate, not meant for development, not meant for profit, but perhaps meant for purpose. The idea came quietly, not dramatic, not sudden. What if the cottage became a space for women like that? Not a business, not a formal institution, just a place for tea, conversation, shared stories. A small circle of chairs beneath the wall where Leonard once kept my photographs. A place where widows didn't have to pretend they were coping perfectly. I sat down at the desk again and wrote, "The cottage will not be sold. It will be shared." My hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of decision. Leonard had built barriers to protect the property, but he had left its heart untouched. That would be my work. As I closed the journal for the evening, I felt something settle inside me, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Victor would not understand this choice. Others might question it. But the cottage was never meant to be an asset on paper. It was meant to be something living. And for the first time since I turned that key in the door, I understood what Leonard's note had meant. This wasn't an inheritance. It was an invitation, and I had just decided to accept it. The first afternoon, I unlocked the cottage for someone other than myself. My hands shook more than they had the day I discovered Leonard's secrets. Grief can make you protective. It tells you to guard what remains, but purpose asks you to open the door anyway. I had invited 3 women from the community center. Nothing formal, just tea and conversation. I didn't advertise it. I didn't create flyers. I simply called them and said, "I have a quiet place if you'd like to sit somewhere that doesn't feel so loud." They arrived cautiously. Ruth brought lemon cookies wrapped in foil. Helen carried a small potted fern. Clara apologized 3 times for imposing, even though I had invited her myself. The moment they stepped inside, they fell silent. It wasn't because of the photographs. Those I had carefully taken down and stored in a cedar chest. That chapter was mine alone. It was the warmth. The cottage had a way of holding people gently. We sat in a small circle near the fireplace, At first, we spoke of ordinary things: the weather, rising grocery prices, the ache in our knees when rain approaches. But slowly, like ice melting, the real words began to surface. Ruth confessed she still set 2 plates at dinner some nights. Helen admitted she hadn't slept on her own side of the bed since her husband passed. Clara said the hardest part wasn't the silence, it was how quickly the world moved on. As they spoke, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I had thought Leonard's secret house was a monument to what he hid. Now I understood it was a gift of space. Not space to dwell in sorrow, space to breathe through it. When the afternoon light began to fade, no one rushed to leave. They lingered by the door, reluctant but lighter. "Same time next week?" Ruth asked. I smiled. "If you'd like." After they left, I remained standing in the quiet cottage. The air felt different, not heavy with memory, but alive with voices. I walked to Leonard's desk and opened the blank journal again. Today the cottage began to belong to more than me. I paused, then added, Leonard thought he was protecting me from being taken advantage of, but what he really protected was my freedom to choose what this place would become. He had kept secrets, yes. He had carried his illness alone longer than I would have wished. That truth still stung in tender places, but love is rarely perfect in its execution. Sometimes it shows up as silence when we wish for confession. Sometimes it shows up as preparation when we wish for partnership. As I locked the cottage that evening, I looked back once more at the small white structure tucked among the pines. For years, I thought that door represented exclusion. Then I thought it represented betrayal. Now I know it represented trust. Leonard trusted that when the time came, I would step through fear, through grief, through doubt, and build something that reflected who I truly was. And here is what I have learned. Sitting by that fireplace week after week with women who once believed their stories were over, the greatest secrets our loved ones leave behind are not hidden rooms or lockboxes. They are quiet reminders that life does not end when one chapter closes. It simply asks us, gently, bravely, to begin another. And sometimes the key we're given is not meant to unlock the past. It is meant to open the door to who we are still becoming. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story touched you, please tap the like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from or sharing a small part of your own story.